You've seen the alignment chart, lawful good, chaotic evil, endless debates, but it didn't start as a morality system. Alignment was a cosmic war, law versus chaos, pulled from Moorcock, Anderson, and early war gamers with wild ideas. And once you see it that way, it changes everything. This is the forgotten origin of alignment, today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. Today, we're going to be talking about alignment. It's one of the most misunderstood concepts in the history of Dungeons & Dragons, and so I'm going to break it down and talk about where alignment came from and why it was included in the game in the first place. And then at the end of the video, kind of the second part, I guess you could call it, I'm going to discuss ways that you can bring back that original version of alignment and how you can use it in really any system or edition of Dungeons and Dragons that you play even today in 2025. So I have done videos on alignment before, one specifically where I just talked about how alignment was presented in each different edition throughout the decades of Dungeons and Dragons. However, this one is really going to focus on the original presentation of alignment and original D&D from 1974, and also get into where those ideas come from. Why was it even in the game, and how did it evolve from some of the predecessor games before Dungeons and Dragons? I'm going to talk about the inspirational texts, like my book here, 3 Hearts and 3 Lines by Paul Anderson. Also Michael Moorcock's books, of course, will be crucial in this. And then I'm going to, again, like I said, talk about some of those predecessor games of that came before Dungeons and Dragons that helped us get to the game that we have today. And I really think that it will be a great way of looking at a concept that, again, I think has been sort of misconstrued, misunderstood, and figuring out, why so many people don't like alignment now. I know, like in the current version of the game, the 2024 edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and I don't have those books, but my understanding is that alignment is really kind of pushed to the back in that version because so many people don't want to use it anymore. And I think that the reason that they don't want to use it is because it's been presented in such a way that makes it seem like it's not useful to the game anymore. And so I want to kind of get back to those original roots of where alignment comes from. So if these kinds of deep dives are something that interests you, where you want to learn about these older concepts of the game and figure out how they can be used in current versions of Dungeons & Dragons, again, regardless of which edition you're playing, then please take a few seconds to like the video, make sure that you're subscribed to the channel, and then adjust your settings so that the notification bell will alert you when I upload new videos. I also want to take a quick second to thank all the new subscribers that I got from my last videos. So the video that I published last week, which was the forgotten rules of D&D that actually made the game better. That video for me, for my channel, exploded. So it's got more than twice the number of views within a time period that the second most popular video that I have within the last 10 got. So that's great. And it generated a lot of new subscribers. And I want to welcome you all to the channel. I know that this channel is different from the standard YouTube fare. It's not short, quippy, clickbait type content that is like polished and super edited and again, like super choppy. I don't do that. I don't script my videos. I talk off the cuff. I make a bullet point list of things that I want to talk about, but I never know exactly how I'm going to say it until I record the videos. So I know most of you at this point have discovered that and you like that casual conversational tone. And I appreciate you for sticking around for that because, again, I know it goes against the grain of what YouTube has been feeding you on other channels, which is, again, those really short, very polished and very well edited videos. And that's not my channel. So I know a lot of people that watched that video that had never watched my channel before. I got comments that said like, this entire video should have been 10 minutes long and I didn't watch it because it was too long. And I appreciate that it can be 10 minutes long for some people, but if you didn't watch the video, I don't think you would know why I didn't fit it within 10 minutes. So thanks to all of you who do stick around for my long form content because I really, really appreciate it. All right, so let's dive in and talk about what we're talking about today. And what I want to start with is sort of a look at the predecessor games that came before Dungeons and Dragons. Now, there are a ton of games in this lineage, and they stretch back really far, and they include, but are not limited to, but games like Tony Bass's Hyboria game from the late 1960s, I believe that was. And there was Leonard Patt's Middle Earth miniature war games rules that then kind of got adapted or borrowed or modified, whatever you want to say, for the fantasy supplement in Chainmail. So from 1971 originally was Chainmail. And then you have stuff, of course, like Dave Wesley's Brownstein rules. And then it's kind of partner game or cousin game, whatever you want to call that, Dwayne Jenkins' Brownstone rules. So all of those are really important in this look at alignment being used in Dungeons and Dragons. So, the Hyboria campaign has, different wargaming factions in it, of course. You have the Middle Earth game from Leonard Patt that involves those Tolkiensian concepts of good guys fighting bad guys. Okay. So, and that, since that inspired Chainmail, that's going to then come into Dungeons and Dragons as well. In Dave Wesley's Brownstein games, you have the emphasis on character role playing, but you have also a look at, different characters have different goals. And one of the things that those goals will kind of help guide you toward when you're playing in that game is creating alliances with other characters so that you're both trying to achieve your goals together, even though you might not necessarily be trying to achieve the same goals. But it does evolve into kind of like this faction play, and again, making alliances. And I'm going to talk about that very specifically again in a few minutes here. But also in Brownstone, same kind of idea, right? So it's not every man for himself. Everybody has their own individual goals and those types of games, those Brownstein's type of games. But over time, you're going to make alliances with people because you have a better chance of accomplishing what you want if you have allies working with you. So, most of those games, with the exception, I think, of the Middle Earth game, they're not really about good versus evil. But they're really just about sort of like rival groups that are competing for different goals. They have conflicting goals, but a lot of times they will work together, like I was mentioning. Okay, so, but the two games that I want to talk about that are most specifically, like directly, most previously linked prior to Dungeons and Dragons would be Blackmoor and Chainmail. And again, these aren't the only ones. I mean, you've got like diplomacy even that involves role playing, but just to make things quick and easy, I'm going to focus specifically on Blackmoor and on Chainmail. So if we look at Blackmoor, now I have been told that Dave Arneson's Blackmoor didn't necessarily have alignment in it the way that we think of alignment in Dungeons and Dragons, that he didn't use that. So Blackmoor is Dave Arneson's medieval Brownstein type game. So it evolves out of those styles of games. Again, individual people having individual goals. And then naturally, through the course of play, the players will begin to kind of form alliances with other players to accomplish the goals that they want to accomplish. So I have a couple of different ways to talk about Blackmoor here. One is that I've mentioned this on the channel before, but last year in April of 2024, I went to DaveCon in Minneapolis. So that's DaveCon for the 3 days. It's Arneson, Wesley, and McGarry. And McGarry, apologies, I just forgot how to pronounce his name, but the most well-known, I would say, for creating the game Dungeon, the board game of that TSR put out in 1975. But while I was there, I got to play in a game run by Bill Hoyt, who was one of the original, like the Blackmoor bunch. He was one of that Twin Cities gaming group, friends with Dave Arneson. And he ran a game that was, I guess, modeled after, and it might have even been like the exact game that Dave Arneson ran. There were models. We used miniatures. And my understanding is that at least most, if not all, of the miniatures that we used were the actual ones that these guys used back in like the early 70s, late 60s. Okay, so there were miniatures, and everybody had a different army that they were given, or a faction, whatever you want to call it, right? So I was given the bandits. So from the role playing aspect, I'm kind of like role playing the bandit leader, but I am leading a group of people, and I was given a set of objectives that I was going to accomplish, or that I should accomplish in order to kind of, quote unquote, win. Now, the rules were sort of based a little bit very similar to it. At least it seemed to me they were very similar, like chainmail. So you're rolling 2d6s to determine success for what you would doing in the game, especially like during combat. Okay, if you were fighting other troops. Now, the Blackmoor Castle was on the table, the model that was the model for the Castle Blackmoor in Dave Arneson's group. So it was sort of like a combination of like a Blackmoor game and like a war game. Okay, so I was playing a bandit faction. Well, the thing is, there were other factions of bandits. I wasn't the only one. There were Vikings also. There were like other kinds of sea raiders. There were peasant groups. Okay, and there were like at least 2 groups of peasants, if not more. And what I remember very specifically is that the peasants, depending on which one you were controlling, had very different goals. One of them was more like rebellious, and one of them, like they wanted to kind of upset the status quo, and then the other one kind of wanted to just preserve their town and keep the bandits from like stealing the stuff from the church and breaking in and taking all the gold and the other items that could be used to make money from the church. And then you had like the castle, and it had like its guards and soldiers and like knights. Okay, so in a way, this is like it's 2 things. One, it's faction play, because for me as one of the bandits, what I realized was like my goals were, of course, were like loot and pillage, like, to steal as much stuff as I can to make money. And based on what I'm able to get, that helped me achieve my goals. Okay. But the people in the castle are trying to stop me from doing that. And their troops were way better than my troops. So I was, light, nimble, and, I'm also not very tactically minded, unfortunately. So I went out the gate like I started pillaging on my first turn before I kind of knew long term what I was going to be doing. I would play it very differently next time were I to play. But what I figured out was, not all of the different factions entered the game at the same time. And so after a while, when I kind of started to see like what was going on, I was starting to try to make an alliance with one of the peasant groups that looked like they were wanting to sort of not necessarily be under the yoke of the people in the castle telling them what to do. And so I was trying to make an alliance with them. I was also trying to reach the people over on the coast, because the Vikings didn't come in on the first turn. They came in, and I forget what turn it was. It was later in the game. But I was hoping to kind of like meet up with them to use them to bolster my forces, because I was getting picked off by the soldiers from the castle when they finally emerged from the castle and began trying to defend their territory. And but these are all kind of factions. And if you look at it, it's not really good guys versus bad guys. It's sort of like law and order and status quo, the people in the castle who want to stay in power and keep things the way that they're, run, but also protect their territory, which included the peasants who were not trying to rebel against them. And then you had these more anarchist groups. You had me as the bandits. You had these Viking raiders coming in. You had these peasants that were trying to upset the status quo. So it was kind of like, in a way, a battle between law and chaos, not described in those terms, but based on the factions that we were given, that's kind of what it ended up being like. Okay. Now, again, as I understand it, Dave Arneson didn't necessarily use those types of terms in the games that he ran, but the games that he ran do involve those types of concepts, even if they're not named. Now, if we look at some of the stuff that Dave Arneson wrote, so again, we've seen this on the channel before. This is First Fantasy Campaign, published by Judges Guild, 1977. So this is coming out post publication of D&D from 1974. Okay, but but this is really like Dave Arneson's notes for his campaign, or like, how he ran his campaign. Now, it is difficult to kind of understand how much in here was influenced by the publication of Dungeons and Dragons, that he would have rewritten it so that this could be used to play a game of D&D. This First Fantasy Campaign could be used, because again, it's 1977, so it's 3 years after, and so it is sometimes hard, I think, for us reading this to understand how much of this was exactly from Dave's game pre Dungeons and Dragons, and how much did he modify or change so that it could be used with Dungeons and Dragons. And I think it's very difficult to tell which parts. But even if you get into this first part here. So this is Blackmoor the campaign. So that's what this is. It says First Fantasy campaign, but this is his Blackmoor campaign. And it's the First Fantasy campaign because he's saying like, this is the first fantasy campaign ever. I don't think it was a great title because as a kid, I never really understood. I thought it was just a generic, like First Fantasy campaign. Like this is the first one you should use. I didn't understand as a kid that this meant that this was the first fantasy campaign that ever existed, but they didn't use Blackmoor on the title here because of, I'm guessing, some kind of trademark issues. Because by that point, Blackmoor was published and parts of it were being used by TSR. But then he does use it on the inside here, so who knows? I don't know why they could use it inside and not on the title. But he's talking essentially in here about his game, and you see here, the course of the conflict might change some of the alignments, but barring anything major, I laid them out for the entire year. So he uses the word alignment here. So each area had a certain budget available. The budget is given a little later on, as well as an alignment rating for each of the 4 seasons of the coming year. And then you look here, and he has the evil forces, the neutral forces, and the good forces. So that's pretty much like alignment, but on the moral aspect of like good versus evil, right? But he's using those terms. Now, once again, I don't know if this is how he originally laid it out pre-publication of Dungeons and Dragons, but I think it's pretty clear that he did have these evil forces, and he talks about them in some other places. So that's just one example here from First Fantasy Campaign. Okay, but now if we look at, this is Blackmoor Foundations, History, Maps, and Lore from 1971 to 1985. Now, this is published by the folks who put together the Secrets of Blackmoor documentary, and they sent me, this is sort of like their beta test. They sent this to me last year. Beta test isn't the right word. So beta version, whatever you want to call it. So you see it says advanced uncorrected proof. But the corrected one is now out for sale, and you can get it from them. And I highly encourage anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff to definitely check it out. But this is like basically it reprints a bunch of notes, typewritten pages and stuff, or sometimes handwritten, from Dave Arneson, his maps as well. And then there's like commentary over, like, so it's usually like the papers are over here on the right, and then the commentaries on the left, which is really cool. So, again, you see all the maps and stuff. But the page I want to look at here is a page, in my version at least, it's on page 80. Now, this is, you see it says Midwest Military Simulation Association. And it tells you over here that this is from the Corner of the Tabletop. This was a newsletter that Dave Arneson published. And this is the Blackmoor Gazette and Rumor Monger 2. This is volume 4, issue number 3 from May of 1972. So this predates Dungeons and Dragons. Again, this is May of 72. And you see here, it's hard to get close to the camera. It says castle burned while heroes away. Heroes, he's got a little typo there. And he says, well, all that running around in the dungeons finally got the castle wiped out while our flock of heroes went looking for adventure and treasure. Although the expedition supposedly bagged the evil wizard of the dungeon. Okay, so that's just the part I want to focus on. So he's describing certain factions in this game as being evil, which would imply then that others are good, right? So like the heroes, you would take that means that they're good and they're fighting this evil wizard. So again, without using the term alignment, it really seems as though, well, it's not seems, it's proof. Dave Arneson did have these concepts of good and evil in his game. And that is very consistent, again, with like the Tolkien writings from the time where, Sauron is evil. There's no like, you're going to redeem him or whatever. Like, he is evil and the Fellowship is good. And the ring is evil, and the ring can, change you into being, evil and selfish and greedy and all those kinds of things. So these concepts of good and evil in these types of games predate the publication of Dungeons and Dragons. So it does muddy the waters a little bit because, and the premise that I'm going to get to here later on is to say that I don't believe that the good and evil axis is helpful with the discussion of alignment in modern Dungeons and Dragons, or even like in any edition of Dungeons and Dragons. I think it muddies the waters and it makes things confusing. And I'm going to talk about why as we continue this discussion. So another thing with the Blackmoor game that we can look at are some of the documents from the players from back then. So first up is this character sheet from Dave McGarry, and this is one of the characters that he played in the Blackmoor game. And I got this character sheet from the Secrets of Blackmoor, the documentary, like their website. And you see on the character sheet here, this is a very early version of a character sheet. It's handwritten, and it's really talking about like the abilities. It's given the abilities different scores, right? Different numerical scores of how to relate them to each other. But it also lists equipment and then sort of like some interests, or, I guess what we would now call skills. I talk all about that in my video on the history of skills in Dungeons and Dragons. But what we don't see on here is a notification for what kind of alignment. Even if we're not using that word, there's no indication of anything like that as far as like a personality of like whether they're a good person or a bad person, or even really what faction they're following if they are doing so. That it would be an indication that like these things maybe didn't come up as often in Dave Arneson's Blackmoor games. Now, the other thing we looked at this book a minute ago, the Blackmoor Foundations book. There's a really fun section on here of early documents, and this is known as the Spanish Royals Character Matrix, which belonged to a player named Dan Nicholson. And we see the document reproduced here. So this is from May of 1971, and this is for the Kingdom of Spain. So in addition to running his medieval Brownstein games of Blackmoor, Dave Arneson was also running Brownstein-like games after Dave Wesley had to leave. I think he went into the army, maybe? I forget exactly why Dave Wesley left, but Dave Arneson kind of took over running those games for him. And so he was still running like Napoleonic-style games. And as you see here, this sheet has these, what we would call, essentially ability scores: looks, brains, sex, which was sex appeal, guts, health, and then miscellaneous, and then like the birth date here of all these different characters. So this was more concerned, this is Kingdom of Spain. So this is more concerned with the relationship between like the descendants and how they were related to each other and how many of them there were, for forming alliances, like marrying your kids off and creating strategic marriages, which is in itself a form of faction play, and creating alliances, which does relate to this idea of alignment later on. And we're going to see that as we continue the discussion. Okay, so now let's look at Chainmail, originally published in 1971 by Guidon Games. This is a later printing, as you see here. This one's published by TSR. But, the contents were pretty much the same. And what we want to focus on again here is in the back, the fantasy supplement, which, as I mentioned before, is very strongly based on the work by Leonard Patt and his Middle-earth miniatures game. Okay? And what we see here is a description of all these different kinds of characters that you can play: dwarves, elves, halflings, sprites, goblins. Okay, the armies that you would control. So these wouldn't be individual characters for the most part. You can do man-to-man combat here, but mostly you'd be doing armies. But you've got orcs and heroes, superheroes, wizards, that kind of thing. And again, with this stuff with like heroes, superheroes, the different types of wizards, which include sorcerers, warlocks, magicians, and seers. I just did a video on the history of level titles in Dungeons and Dragons and why they were included and how you can still use them in games today. So that was another popular video, and you might want to check that out if this sounds interesting to you, because the concept of level titles starts all the way back here in Chainmail. And even kind of predates it as well, but this is like one of the books that I used. So what I want to focus on here, though, is this chart here on page 39. It says general lineup. And then he says, it is impossible. When I say he, I mean Gary Gygax. He's the one that wrote this fantasy supplement. It is impossible to draw a distinct line between good and evil fantastic figures. These three categories are listed below as a general guide for the wargamer designing orders of battle involving fantastic creatures. And then for law, he's got halflings, dwarves, gnomes, heroes, superheroes, wizards, treants, and magic weapons. And then for neutral, he has sprites, pixies, elves, fairies, lycanthropes, giants, rocks, and then elementals and parentheses, and then chimeras. And then for chaos, he has goblins, kobolds, orcs, anti-heroes, wizards, wraiths, wights, lycanthropes, ogres, true trolls, giants, dragons, and basilisks. And then he says an asterisk indicates that the figure appears in two lists. And that would be wizards, who appear in the law and the chaos list. And then lycanthropes, who appear in neutral and chaos. Giants, who appear in neutral and chaos. And then he says, underlined neutral figures have a slight predisposition for law. Neutral figures can be diced for to determine on which side they will fight, with the meaning, with ties meaning that they remain neutral. And then elves and rocks are underlined for neutral, which means that they have a slight disposition for law. So this idea where he says you can't distinguish, you can't draw a distinct line between good and evil for fantastic figures. And so instead he divides them into these law, neutral, and chaos categories. He says to have your order of battle for the order of battle. So what he's talking about here, and I have mentioned this before, but the idea is that, while pretty much these creatures on here are either coming from two sources. They're coming from Earth mythology, mostly Greek. Okay. You've got chimeras and rocks and things like that. But also from Tolkien, obviously. I mean, he's right out the gate. He's got treants, he's got orcs and, goblins and things like that. So, of course, goblins and orcs and all that stuff predate Tolkien, but they're very associated with Tolkien now. Well, the thing is, you have to remember, this is 1971 when this comes out. So while Tolkien was very popular with college students and, with some war gamers, okay, it wasn't ubiquitous like it is now. Now, most people think fantasy, and usually the first thing that comes, I guess, would be Tolkien, although nowadays you could argue that, like in my daughter's game that I run for her, I asked them their familiarity with fantasy, and my daughter was the only one that was familiar with anything from Tolkien. The other kids said things like Harry Potter and Avatar: The Last Airbender. But at the time, Tolkien was so new that some of these creatures, people might not know what they were or how to organize them into armies. And if you looked in, some of these terms people used to just equate together. Like a lot of times you would get things like sprites, pixies, elves, and fairies all as just synonyms of the same thing. Or like a dwarf might be listed as a synonym for a goblin even, or a kobold. So while we think of them as being distinct species of creatures, a lot of these terms over the years have been kind of muddied and used to be intermixed and used as, like I said, as synonyms for each other. So you might not necessarily know, like we know from reading Tolkien, that a dwarf would never ally with a goblin in a Tolkien style game. But people who were reading this at the time, there's some of them that might not have been aware of that. So dividing them into these groups of law, neutral, and chaos helped the people that were organizing these orders of battle to know which sides would ally with other sides. So if you're fighting a World War II game, you know that the British are never going to ally with the Nazis, okay? Because those are two different sides in the war. That's something that you would know from history. Just like, if you're playing a Napoleonic game, you know which sides are going to ally. But when you're playing a game like this with fantasy creatures, if you're not familiar with what those creatures are, you needed a way to describe who they're going to ally with during these actions. So this was kind of the start to me of a unique look at alignment, because he says you can't draw a distinct line between good and evil fantastic figures. So he's organizing them into law, chaos, and neutrality, and that's because that's coming from some of the source fiction that he read that helped him to figure out a way that he could define how they would fight without implying their morality, without saying they're good or evil. He's saying, oh, well, they're going to align themselves. He doesn't use the word align, but their lineup is going to be based on these ideas of law, neutrality, and chaos, because again, that's coming from the source fiction. Well, what is the source fiction that we're talking about? We're going to talk about that here in just a second. Okay, so let's go over some of that inspirational fiction that was used to kind of help develop this alignment system in original D&D. And just really quick, let's talk about what that system is. And then I'm going to go back to it in detail later. But this is from Men and Magic, 1974. And you see here again, it's using the terms from Chainmail, Law, Neutrality, and Chaos. Now, it's going to define it differently in here a little bit, and we'll get to that in a second. But why is Gary using Law, Neutrality, and Chaos? Well, this is the Dungeon Master's Guide 1979 for advanced D&D. But if we look in the back here, I have, again, talked about this before. I have a whole video talking about this book and what it brought change-wise to Dungeons and Dragons. And if we look at Appendix N, this is the famous Appendix N, Inspirational and Educational Reading. You're going to see a couple listed here that I want to spend time on. So we see, first off, Paul Anderson, 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, and he also lists the High Crusade and the Broken Sword. And then another writer here is going to be Michael Moorcock, and you see he lists Stormbringer, Stealer of Souls, Hawkmoon series, and he says especially the first 3 books. Okay, so that, I mean, obviously there's a whole list here, but those are the 2 that we're going to talk about. So I want to read some quotes from these books so that we can understand where this law and chaos thing got developed instead of Gary saying good and evil. Because again, remember in Chainmail, he says you can't assign good or evil. You can't distinguish between that for fantastic creatures. So I unfortunately don't have the actual physical books of Moorcock's Elric stories, Stormbringer, and all that kind of stuff. I checked them out from the library when I was a kid. I struggled with reading them a little bit, to be quite honest. I mean, I was probably too young to try to be understanding them. And I just never bought them as physical books as an adult. But I'm going to read some quotes here. I'll just put them up on the screen. So the purpose of this part of the video is to help talk about the describing alignment as a cosmic struggle, not as a shorthand description of your character's personality. That's not what alignment originally was. And that goes back to Chainmail. It was designed for your order of battle to know what side you're going to fight on, not to tell you whether you're a good person or a bad person or an evil person. Okay. So in terms of looking at like how this is not good versus evil, we're going to look at a quote here from Michael Moorcock. This is from the Scaling Tree. And the quote is, "There is a madness in chaos, just as there can be in law. The forces take many forms and many names across the multiverse. To call them good or evil is never to know them, never to control them, for there are times when chaos does good and law does evil and vice versa." Okay. So that is sort of a quote that helps explain this idea that law doesn't necessarily mean good and chaos doesn't necessarily mean evil, because there's times when it's vice versa. Okay. So now this is a long quote, but I think it's a good one. And again, it helps to explain this idea. So he says, "Law and chaos," I said, "they're not the same as good and evil, I'm told. Merciful heavens, no, not at all. Not at all. Evil is a cruel and selfish thing. Chaos can be wild and generous. And just as some lords of law are self-sacrificing and concerned for others, so are some lords of chaos." And that's from The White Wolf's Son, The Albino Underground, from Michael Moorcock. Now, in this idea that law doesn't mean necessarily good and chaos doesn't necessarily mean evil. And the fact is, we're not even talking about good and evil here. We're talking about law and chaos. This is going to come from Paul Anderson's 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. This book, I definitely highly recommend. You can see it's super short, but the Paladin class comes directly out of 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. The fact of trolls, needing to burn trolls and using fire to cause them or else they regenerate, that comes from this book. And this idea of law and chaos partially comes from this book, as well as Moorcock. Now, I've been told from some sources, or I've read some sources that say that even Moorcock himself was influenced by these books by Paul Anderson to develop this concept of law and chaos for the Elric of Monimene books. So I'm not, I don't have confirmation of that, but I have read that. So the passage I want to read is here in my version. It's on page 22. So Holger is the main character. And he says, and just as a quick side, like, he's from Earth and he's been transported to another world. It's one of those classic stories of the man out of place and time. And so he's in this other world that is a fantastical, it's a fantasy world. He says, Holger got the idea that a perpetual struggle went on between primeval forces of law and chaos. No, not forces exactly, modes of existence, a terrestrial reflection of the spiritual conflict between heaven and hell. In any case, humans were the chief agents on Earth of law, though most of them were were so only unconsciously, and some witches and warlocks and evildoers had sold out to chaos. A few non-human beings also stood for law. Ranged against them was almost the whole middle world, which seemed to include realms like Fairy, Trollheim, and the Giants, an actual creation of chaos. Wars among men, such as the long drawn-out struggle between the Saracens and the Holy Empire, aided chaos. Under law, all men would live in peace and order, and that liberty which only law could give meaning. But this was so alien to the Middle Worlders that they were forever working to prevent it and to extend their own shadowy dominion. So he is starting to he uses the phrase evildoers selling out to chaos. So there is a slight twinge here where he's equating law with good and chaos with evil, but he does say it's like these primeval forces or modes of existence. Okay, so it's different. It goes beyond that. All right. So in terms of looking at law being about stasis and order, I mentioned that before, kind of like that status quo idea. This is, again, going back to Moorcock. Only law could create such perfection, and Elric thought such perfection defeated progress. That the twin forces complemented one another was now plainer than ever before, and for either to gain complete ascendancy over the other meant entropy or stagnation for the cosmos. Even though law might dominate the earth, chaos must be present and vice versa. So again, it's this balance between these two forces, and if either one of them gains the upper hand, that's going to be a problem because things are going to stagnate. Okay, and then here's another quote. This is from another Michael Moorcock book, from the same saga, of course. He says, "While it is in the nature of law," Alistar explained, "to be forever fixed." So that's what law is trying to accomplish. So if that's what law is doing, what's chaos doing? Well, it's the opposite. It's entropy and it's change. So the quote here, "Elric knew that in reality, chaos was the harbinger of stagnation, for though it changed constantly, it never progressed." And then another quote, "Chaos has her moods and whims, that's all. As I told you, she cannot remain stable. It is in her nature to be forever changing." This is one of my favorite quotes in all of this, that kind of this back and forth dialogue between the characters talking about this. So the quote is, "The sign of chaos," Elric exclaimed. "Perhaps I should have guessed." "What does it mean, Elric?" Moonglum asked. "That is the symbol of everlasting disruption and anarchy," Elric told him. "We are standing in territory presided over by the Lords of Entropy or one of their minions. So that is who our enemy is. This can only mean one thing. The book is of extreme importance to the order of things on this plane, possibly all the myriad planes to the multiverse. It is why Ariok was reluctant to aid me. He, too, is a Lord of Chaos." Moonglum stared at him in puzzlement. "What do you mean, Elric?" "Know you not that two forces govern the world, fighting an eternal battle?" Elric replied. "Law and chaos. The upholders of chaos state that in such a world as they rule, all things are possible. Opponents of chaos, those who ally themselves with the forces of law, say that without law, nothing material is possible. Some stand apart, believing a balance between the two is the proper state of things, but we cannot. We have become embroiled in a dispute between the two forces. The book is valuable to either faction, obviously, and I could guess that the minions of entropy are worried what power we might realize or what power we might release if we obtain this book. Law and chaos rarely interfere directly in men's lives. That is why only adepts are fully aware of their presence. Now perhaps I will discover at last the answer to the one question which concerns me. Does an ultimate force rule over the opposing factions of law and chaos?" So that's from Elric, the Stealer of Souls. And I think, and it starts to tease the idea of balance, which is, again, going to be the neutrality aspect. And so speaking of, here's a quote on that, also from Michael Moorcock. "The balance is there to ensure that neither law nor chaos ever gain complete ascendancy, for the one offers sterility while the other offers only sensation." So it's describing that, like, law, these quotes about law, I think, are the ones that are really important to me, because it's explained that, like, law isn't about being good. It's about, like, keeping things the way that they are, which might not necessarily be a good thing. And in fact, in the Moorcock books, he's saying it definitely is not, because law is sterile. It's keeping everything from, growing and changing. But on the other hand, chaos is only about change, which means nothing ever stays the same. So there's never any kind of like baseline. It's just constantly in entropy. So these are the kinds of forces, and the way that I think is an interesting approach to how alignment is explained in original D&D. So now that we have kind of that background from those inspirational texts, those quotes from Moorcock and Anderson to sort of understand, and those aren't the only quotes. Obviously, I only read one from Anderson, but it's one of my favorite ones. But the kinds of stuff that Gary Gygax was reading that would have helped inform his decision to pick Law and Chaos as his descriptions of this lineup, this order of battle, whatever you want to call it. And it colors, at least to me, my perception of what alignment really could be, as opposed to, again, a lazy shorthand way of describing a character's personality. So let's look at how it's explained here in the 1974 release of Dungeons and Dragons. Obviously, this is a later printing, but it's the same books, just, like different, little bit of different cover art. And, the original box, again, was that fake wood grain box. This is what's known as the white box. Okay, but you have this description in here. So it says character alignment, including various monsters and creatures. Before the game begins, it is not only necessary to select a role, which would be a class, but it is also necessary to determine what stance the character will take: law, neutrality, or chaos. So this is very, very important here. The word stance, it's chosen to position a character within this larger conflict. So it's not personality, it's a stance. You are allying yourself. You're aligning yourself with one of these forces. And he says character types are limited as follows by this alignment. Now, this is interesting. So under law, and this is going to kind of mirror a little bit what we saw in Chainmail as far as like which creatures are where. But under law, you have men with an asterisk, halflings, patriarchs, treants, unicorns, pegasi, hippogriffs, elves with an asterisk, lycanthropes, which are underlined and asterisk, rocks, asterisk, dwarves, gnomes, dwarves/gnomes, asterisk, and centaurs, asterisk. And then you have neutrality, men, again with the asterisk, nixies, pixies, dryads, griffins, animals, elves with an asterisk, rocks, asterisk, dwarves/gnomes, asterisk, lycanthropes, underlined asterisk, orcs, ogres, and dragons, all underlined, wyverns, centaurs with that asterisk, hydra, purple worms, sea worms, chimera, underlined, minotaurs, and giants, underlined. And then for chaos, you have men, asterisk, again. You have evil high priests, goblins/kobolds, hobgoblins/gnolls, giants, orcs, ogres, all three of those are underlined, trolls, wights, lycanthropes, underlined and asterisk, ghouls, wraiths, mummies, specters, vampires, medusa, manticores, gargoyles, gorgons, minotaur, and then the last three are minotaurs, dragons, and chimera, which are all three underlined. And then it says an asterisk indicates that the name appears in both the law and neutrality columns, and then underlined indicates that the name appears in both the neutrality and chaos columns. So the ones that we see are men can be law, neutrality, or chaos. Okay, and lycanthropes are the same. That's kind of funny because he underlines lycanthropes and asterisks them, but men, he only puts an asterisk, but then he lists them under all three columns. So I think that was just a typo. Okay, and then you have things like giants appearing in neutral and chaos, and you have minotaurs, same thing. You have dragons, same thing. And then you have like dwarves and gnomes appearing under law and under neutrality. So what's interesting to me here, there's a few different things. So again, this word stance, okay? So being able to determine how you want to fight. Okay, and then it says that, it's assigning these monsters or characters, creatures, whatever you want to call them. It's assigning them to a specific side or a stance within this conflict. Okay, but then it says, well, there's a few things. So one, he lists evil high priests under chaos. So now again, we are going to start confusing what does chaos mean if the evil high priest is there. Okay, so that's the only one that says evil, although, most people would say something like a vampire is evil, but, we don't know that. Okay. We know that they're chaotic because they're listed here, but this is not that they act chaotically. It's that they have allied themselves by picking the stance of chaos. That's what this means. So the other thing it says, the character has to pick a stance. Determine which stance the character will take, law, neutrality, or chaos. So to me, that means that as a player character, you can choose whether to be lawful, chaotic, or neutral. But then he says character types are limited as follows by this alignment. So does that mean that if I'm playing an elf, I can only choose to be lawful or neutral? I can't choose as a player character to be on the side of chaos. I can't choose my stance as being chaos, because he says you can choose a stance of law, neutrality, or chaos, but then it's limited. So the wording again here is confusing, and it creates a lot of questions. Okay, now if I'm playing a human, that's what men means. This is just an antiquated way of just saying human, right? If I'm playing human, then this would tell me that I can pick to be on the side of law, neutrality, or chaos. But if I'm a dwarf or a gnome, I can only pick to be on the side of law or neutrality. And of course, a lot of these aren't player character types, at least here, although later on it's going to tell you that there's no reason that you can't play. In fact, it's right here. There's no reasons that players cannot be allowed to play as virtually anything, provided they begin relatively weak and work their way up to the top. Okay, but here's what's interesting as well. You see orcs listed under chaos, but orcs are also listed under neutrality, as are ogres. So does that mean that an orc can choose not to follow the stance of chaos and instead choose the stance of neutrality? That's what this implies to me. So I think that creates a lot of questions, and there's a lot of old schoolers that really don't like the idea that armies of orcs and goblins and stuff might not necessarily be evil. And there are a lot of newer players who think that they should have the free will to choose whatever alignment they want. Now, in Tolkien, if you're going to use Tolkien as your basis for your world, the orcs are evil and there's no getting around that. They can't choose to not be so. However, this isn't Tolkien, this is D&D. And according to this chart, an orc can choose the stance of neutrality or chaos. And it says because you get to choose, then you could choose. So you could have an individual orc who chooses to be on the stance of neutrality, or you could have whole cultures or tribes or whatever of orcs, some that are on the stance of chaos and some that are following the stance of neutrality. So again, I think that is much more complex. It's much more interesting than just saying all orcs are evil or all elves are good or whatever, because we know that that's not the case. So there are, player characters who will play an evil elf. So, but when culturally most elves are good, unless it's the drow, right? Or whatever. So I think that's a more interesting way to look at it and get away from that good evil thing, is look at these concepts of being on the side of law, neutrality, and chaos. Now, in practice, that does become, I think, can become difficult to sort of portray in a game, because how do you actually do that? And that's going to be the second part of the video, is I'm going to give examples and ideas of how you can portray this cosmic battle between law and chaos without muddying it up with the good and evil overlays. However, Gary Gygax himself is going to muddy that up with an article from the Strategic Review. Now I'm going to look at it here in my copy of The Best of Dragon. If you've never read Dragon Magazine, I know that you can find them online as PDFs, right? So that's one way if you want to look at it. But if you want a physical thing of Dragon Magazine, and especially you want to read the early stuff, and those early issues are very, very expensive now to get. I don't even have them. See if you can find a copy of The Best of Dragon. Now, it's still going to be a little bit pricey, but not like the other ones, and you'll get a lot of great content out of here. But there is a really great article in here. For me, it's on page 26 of The Best of Dragon Volume 1, and it is The Meaning of Law and Chaos in Dungeons & Dragons and the Relationship to Good and Evil by Gary Gygax. And he says, many questions continue to arise regarding what constitutes a, quote, lawful act, what sort of behavior is, quote, chaotic, and is what constituted an, quote, evil deed, and how certain behavior is, quote, good. There is considerable confusion in that most dungeon masters construe the terms chaotic and evil to mean the same thing, just as they define lawful and good to mean the same. This is scarcely surprising considering the wording of the three original volumes in Dungeons and Dragons. When that was written, they meant just about the same thing in my mind. Notice I do not say they were synonymous in my thinking at that time. Okay, they meant just about the same thing to me, but I'm not saying that they were synonymous in my thinking. Okay, Gary. The wording in the Greyhawk supplement added a bit more confusion, for by the time that booklet was written, some substantial differences had been determined. In fact, I had the opportunity to do, if I had the opportunity to do D&D over, I would have made the whole business much clearer by differentiating the four categories, and many chaotic creatures would be good, while many lawful creatures would be evil. Before going into the definitions of these four terms, a graphic representation of their relative positions will help the reader to follow the discourse. And then see, he does it here. So he's got good and evil, and then he's got law and chaos, and he puts it on a quadrant here. So you could be lawful good or lawful evil or chaotic good or chaotic evil. And then in the center, he's got neutrality. Okay, so that's how he divided it up. And doing that, I think, is what starts to create this idea that alignment then is less about taking a side in a cosmic war between two opposing forces, because you no longer have two opposing forces. Now you've got four forces that aren't necessarily in opposition to each other. You have good and evil in opposition to each other, but you also have law and chaos in opposition to each other. And that starts to muddy the waters. And it's where people start to think that it's not that you're aligning yourself with the side of good in a cosmic battle against evil. You're saying, I'm a good person. And then evil, same thing. So, and that is where I think, a lot of people want to discard alignment completely because they say that it's too simplistic and it doesn't have a place in the game, and that people are not black and white. And there's degrees of good and evil, and like, how do you determine that and all that kind of stuff? Well, that's the kind of stuff that I'm going to unpack in the second part of the video. But again, I think that to me, I don't want to say it was a mistake, but I think that it, again, caused so much additional confusion. I think, to me, it would have been better for Gary to start laying out, here's how you can play out this cosmic battle between law versus chaos, as opposed to saying, oh, well, in my mind, I was thinking that law equaled good and chaos equaled evil, but that's not what I thought. But I thought that at the time, but I'm going to add good and evil now. And so then you can have lawful good, lawful evil, chaotic good, chaotic evil. So, and then again, over time, the way that it's written in the rule books, in, like, for example, in third edition, it goes at length about the different descriptions, and it has like a whole paragraph for each one of those, and like how you should role play a character like that. And it's not role playing about the side that you're taking in this cosmic battle. It's talking about how to role play your character if you're neutral evil. Here's how you would approach a situation if this happened. This is what a neutral evil character would do, versus this is what a chaotic good character would do, or what a lawful evil character would do. So it's more about the personality of your character. And that gets away from the original reason why alignment was included in the first place, which is why I think so many people think that you don't need it anymore, because just role play your characters the way that you want to play them, and don't worry about trying to adhere to this definition of what it means to be lawful good or chaotic evil or whatever that is. So again, I think that did sort of confuse things a little bit, and it adds fodder for the argument to get rid of alignment. So that's going to start to help us set up this idea of being able to describe how you can use alignment now in current games. But just know that this argument about alignment and whether or not it makes sense in the game, this has been raging since like the game was published. So Gary's already talking about, this is 1976 when that article was written here, the one that I read in the Best of Dragon here, that was originally in Strategic Review. So that's 2 years after the game's been written. And he's saying alignment's already caused a lot of confusion, and he does take the blame because of the way that he wrote it. He wasn't clear. He says that. So, but throughout the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, people are going to be arguing. There's going to be articles in Dragon Magazine and letters to the editor, and there's going to be online forums and all these different things of people arguing about what do these terms mean and how do we actually use them? What point do they have in the game? And so, given that, I think that it's a combination of being too abstract and not abstract enough. And again, we're going to talk about that and how we can try to use it in our games today. Okay, so now we're going to talk about ways that you can use this cosmic alignment, this cosmic war in your games today. Really quickly, though, I would like to ask that if you are looking for a way to support the channel, there's 3 ways that you can do that right now. You can become a super fan and join this other group of people that you see their names listed here, and you'll get your name listed as well. If you become a super fan, just hit that heart icon with the $ in it and let me know that you enjoy the content that I'm making. And again, join this group of very fine folks who have contributed to the channel before, and for which I thank them very much. Second way you can do that is by buying something from my shop. So I have a new shop now. It's at Spread Shop. I've moved on from Spring. I still have my Teespring store open. It's not closed. So if you ordered something from them and it hasn't arrived yet, it shouldn't impact that. But I did start a new Spread Shop, and there you can buy t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, or tote bags. You can call your tote bag like a bag of holding. And those are designs that I created, especially for people like you, fans of Dungeons and Dragons and old school role-playing games who want to show off their passion for games like this. So you'll find those designs there. If you're looking for something like a poster or a sticker or a notebook, I have a separate shop at Redbubble, and I'll put links to that below, but you can get those designs there on those types of items as well. And then the third way, of course, would be by buying my supplement, Alchemy Explosives and Inventions at Drive-Thru RPG. I've shown this before, but it is an old school supplement with class concepts like backgrounds and new character classes, alchemists, demolitionists, inventors. There's pages of equipment. There's a guild hall, a 3-story guild hall with NPCs and intrigue and rumors and plot hooks. And there's just dozens and dozens of random tables that you can use in your games, and advice for running games for expert themed campaigns. So you can find that at Drive-Thru RPG as a PDF or a print on demand in a plain white or parchment style background. Okay, so now back to this idea of how can you use this kind of alignment the way that I'm talking about it. And, again, why did we get away from that? Well, I mean, even if you look at the 1981, and this is the game that I use, the version of the game that I use for my daughter and her friends. And even here it says, lawful behavior is usually the same as behavior that could be called good. And then it says chaotic behavior is usually the same as behavior that could be called evil. So even by here, 1981, it's basically saying, even though this uses the original 3-point alignment system, it only uses law, neutrality, and chaos. It basically tells you that law is good and chaos is evil. I don't play it that way. That's not how I run it in my games. So how do I do it? Well, we need to kind of look at, I think, first off, sort of figuring out, like, what is it that these forces want? What is it that they are hoping that their factions can do for them? So law obviously wants a perfectly ordered cosmos, a stable universe with very rigid hierarchies of, truth is unchangeable. You have these empires that last for eternities, and there's no surprises. So lawful extremes, then, in that case, if you take lawfulness to its extreme, it can start to look like stagnation. There's no free will. There's no innovation. We talked about some of those before. Okay, so think stability, order, hierarchies, stasis, rationality, all of that kind of would be associated with law. So then on the flip side, chaos is looking for a cosmos of infinite possibilities, where everything is kind of fluid. The authority is an illusion in that specific case. So, and when you take chaos to its extreme, then it kind of dissolves everything. It goes away. There's no concepts of things like time or space or identity. It all kind of just morphs into almost like nothingness, again, if you take it to its extreme. So it's entropy, but it's creativity. I like to think of magic as being chaotic because it is flouting. It's going against the laws of nature in a way, and so it's kind of fun to think that, like, all magic, or at least arcane magic, could be chaotic in nature. But randomness, emotions, all that kind of stuff can be chaotic. So again, neither one of those is inherently good or bad. When taken to their extremes, they're both, you could consider them to be bad, right? But on their own, they're not good or evil or any of that kind of thing. They just are. They're both necessary but they're dangerous if taken to the extreme. And they're dangerous if one unbalances the other. And then for neutrality, it's very simple. It just wants to maintain a balance. So sometimes that is taking an active role and it's acting as a steward of balance, like say an order of druids as an example. Okay, but other times it's just people being opportunistic and maybe trying to just avoid this whole law versus chaos thing. That's another form of neutrality, right? Not getting involved. So it's balance. It's not always pacifism. It can be, but it can be either passive or active. Okay, and it includes things like the natural cycles, animal instincts, and just survivalism, being pragmatic. Okay, so those are kinds of some of the things that these forces might want. So then how do we kind of look at introducing the concepts of alignment as a stance and picking a faction? Well, that's pretty easy because your players are then not picking a cosmic side, or they are picking a cosmic side. They're not picking a morality. They're not picking a label to describe how their character acts. They're picking a side that they're going to ally themselves with in this cosmic war. Okay, and so then you can use that to then determine who they might also ally with or who they might be opposed to. And then we look at that, the chart that we saw in here in Men in Magic of monsters being assigned to an alignment, not because of their morality, but because of their allegiance. So undead, as an example, are on the side of chaos and elves are on the side of law. And that's because that's where they fall in the cosmic struggle. So it starts to kind of help you pick apart this idea that these are short terms or shorthand for personality. Okay. And then I think then you can start to do some really fun things like look at a dungeon as sort of being like a chaos wound. So the dungeon is like a place where reality is fraying, it's coming apart. And the dungeon becomes a physical manifestation of this chaotic like entropy that's leaking into the material world. And that's a fun way to kind of look at using a dungeon. And then you can kind of look at monsters, creatures, species, and NPCs as all of them have picked a stance in this war. Okay, so then you can reference back to Men in Magic when we look at this, where it tells you again specifically that your stance is chosen. You choose a stance. Okay, that's very important. So that means that if you want to, you could have your game with a neutral orc because the table tells you that orcs can choose the stance of chaos or neutrality. You could also, if you wanted to, not limit yourself to what this says and maybe have something like a lawful goblin or something like that has chosen, or a tribe of goblins that maybe they're outliers. They're different. They've been pushed out. They've been excised from another group because they decided to choose the side of law. And remember, this isn't personality. They can still be mean and nasty, but they've decided to choose the side of law as the stance that they want to support. Okay. So then you can kind of look at sometimes some creatures or species might be like proxies or tools in this cosmic war. And they might not have a choice. Maybe they don't get to choose, some of them, which stance they're going to follow, because maybe they were created by these cosmic forces to act as these proxies. But then others do get a choice, and that creates really fun role-playing opportunities as to, like, why did you choose to ally yourself and take this stance in this war? And then again, then the dungeon itself sort of becomes a proxy for a cosmic battleground, a cosmic battlefield. And so it's not just a ruin and a pile of rocks and rubble in the world. It's a wound in reality itself where chaos is seeping in. And then maybe the cosmic forces of law is recruiting people, adventurers, and maybe the adventurers aren't even aware of this, but they're being manipulated by this force of law to go in and cleanse this wound and close it up. Okay. And that's a way. And then like maybe over time, the characters figure out, oh, Like they didn't even realize they were being manipulated this way. I think that's, again, a fun approach to it. Okay. So you can run this war sort of like behind the scenes. They can be silent and the players might not necessarily know. They're supposed to pick a stance, but maybe you don't have them pick right away. You don't even talk about it. And it just kind of evolves naturally over the course of the campaign. So the player characters might be pawns. Okay, and they could be unwitting pawns, but they could also be agents. They may have decided that, like, yes, I'm taking a stance and I'm going to pick to do this. Or they could be trying to disrupt this whole idea of that they don't want to be pawns and they want to go against what they feel like they're being forced to do. Okay, so I think that's an example. Now, why would someone want to take a side in this cosmic war? Why would a character care about this cosmic battle between law versus chaos? Because, again, it is very ambiguous. I think it's kind of hard to describe when you think of these things as forces. They're not people. They're not characters. They're not gods. They're like these, like I said, ambiguous, almost like vague forces of the cosmos. And why it's hard to personalize it as a character and figure out, like, why would you care? Okay, well, that's up then to the DM to create some tangible benefits for the players. So it might affect what spells your clerics get. It should affect that. And that's hinted at in Men and Magic, but you're relating it to this idea of, like, the forces of law will not give you access to certain spells. And similarly, the forces of chaos won't give you access to certain spells. So if you know down the road that you want your character to have access to that spell, you need to pick the right stance in order to be able to get that spell. Okay, so that's one example. Magic items are going to be unavailable based on the way that they are attuned to the forces of law or chaos. And if you've taken the stance of chaos and support chaos, a magic item that is on the side of law is not going to let you use it. Okay, so I know these aren't like necessarily groundbreaking ideas, but it's just a way of reframing the discussion of how this stuff can work. It can give you access to different factions, different social affiliations, guilds, temples, patrons. All this kind of stuff is going to be based on what stance you've taken in this cosmic war. And it can also give you like cosmic ties. And this is a really fun way for a dungeon master to introduce these ideas. A character who has decided to follow the stance of chaos might receive strange dreams or mutations, like physical mutations. It could be mental as well, of course, or maybe just whispers coming from the void. That's a way for the DM to introduce information and rumors and plot hooks into the campaign using these cosmic forces. Similarly, a character who's decided to follow the stance of law might receive like a divine omen, okay? Or again, like a lawfully attuned magic item that helps drive your plot forward, okay? And gives adventure hooks for the players. Okay, but there's also role playing. So there's tangible benefits, but there's also role playing benefits. So how to decide like what you're going to support: lawful order, hierarchies, restoring civilizations, a sense of duty, or chaos. Chaos being unfettered power. Again, that magical exploration, I think, is a fun way to look at it. Tearing down oppressive systems can be chaotic. Okay, so the rebellion in Star Wars is technically chaotic. They are trying to upset the status quo, which is the Empire. Okay. Now, it gets muddied because they're trying to upset the status quo by also returning to the previous status quo, which was the Republic. But at the time of the original trilogy, the rebels are the chaos element. They're trying to, they're the monkey in the wrench that's trying to upset the oppressive, but the orderly and structured Empire. Okay, and then if you're neutral, you're taking the stance of neutrality, you're looking for balance, for survival, for being pragmatic, for maybe watching the war without picking sides. Okay, so those are all little ways that you can kind of role play these things within the cosmic war that we're talking about. Now, one of the things that's going to come up, of course, because it tells you in Men and Magic that you're going to pick the stance that your character is going to follow: lawful, neutral, and chaotic. Well, there's a very good chance that you're going to have different characters within the same adventuring party picking different stances. So how's that going to work? Okay, so once you start to add in that good and evil thing, it gets very, very clear, because ideally good characters wouldn't adventure with evil characters, and an evil character would probably try to hide that they were evil if they wanted to adventure with good characters. But with this law versus chaos thing, because we're not talking about good or evil, well, how does that work? Well, it could just be, it adds a lot of really fun role-playing opportunities, but it could be as simple as just mutual self-interest trumping your belief. So banding together, and I talked about that like with that early game that I played, that sort of like war game hybrid with role-playing aspects of that game that I played at DaveCon, where alliances were forming between different factions that necessarily weren't supporting the same side because we all had different goals. But that's where like you're working together with somebody in order to kind of help achieve the goal that you want, even though the other person's goals might not necessarily align with yours all the time. Okay, so your adventurers are professionals. They're going to know where to go to get the best skills that they need to accomplish the tasks that they need to accomplish. So you can think of, if you want to play this way, think of your characters, again, get away from this idea of your characters starting out as heroes out to save the world. It's okay to play that way if you want, but think of your characters maybe a different way, as adventurers, professionals from different nations. Okay, they don't have to be from different nations, but I'm using this as an analogy where you're cooperating together to get treasure, to get gold, to accomplish a goal. You're not cooperating together necessarily just for ideology. Okay, so that's a way of looking at it. It's important to remember that your stance that you're taking in this cosmic war does not equal your personality. So a character who's picked the side of chaos, who you'd say is chaotic, well, they're not necessarily a backstabbing madman. They might just value freedom, unpredictability, or self-expression. Okay, a lawful character isn't always a goody-goody two-shoes. Okay, they might be a ruthless inquisitor or an imperialist. Okay, so those are not things that we would necessarily associate with being good. So you can think like a paladin, but act like a warlord, or vice versa. So again, alignment is your cosmic allegiance, not how you act and not how you, your personality. Okay. So then if you think of it that way, and you think of that your party has a mixture of all these different people following different stances, then your party becomes a microcosm of this cosmic battle just in itself. It's almost like a pressure cooker where things are going to explode at any moment. So the tension between alignments can fuel a lot of really fun, great drama in your games if you like to play that way. So maybe I talked about like this idea of a dungeon being like a chaos wound, okay, in the world. Well, maybe a lawful character wants to seal it off and keep it from seeping into the world, but a chaotic character might want to harness the power for themselves or keep it open, right? So because they want that chaos to spread. So that can create a lot of drama, and it will honestly can create some arguments in the game. We're going to talk about that at the end of this section. So I think the idea, though, is if you're going to have this kind of conflict, it needs to be a slow burn. You don't want to start it right out the gate, okay? It needs to kind of evolve naturally and to that point where it eventually is going to come to a head. And that can either be like a turning point moment, or it could be an end of the campaign. Maybe once the characters realize what's going on and what it means for them to follow these different stances, and they're now in conflict with one another, that could be like a really fun way to end a campaign, as long as you can bring it to a successful conclusion without everybody being upset about it. Okay. Now, what if it's just, this idea of like mercenary parties? We're kind of talking about that, right? So this idea of like, hey, we're just here for the gold. We don't care about this cosmic battle. We're not heroes. We just want to make some money. Okay. Well, what happens? How do you explain that? Well, again, I think that the idea is that it's addressing this tension using, a typical old school method, which is this idea that you might not start out committed to a side in this war, but you might get drawn in over time. That's kind of what's going to happen. And you end up being like Elric or being like Holger from 3 Hearts and 3 Lines. They were sort of, reluctant agents of these cosmic forces. So it could happen over time. So my point is, you don't have to push it on the characters from the very beginning. They can start out just being mercenaries trying to get gold, but then this war is going to drag them in, and sooner or later they're going to feel compelled that they have to pick a side. So, maybe they think that their personal ambitions are going to override this cosmic duty, and that can be very true. They think the cosmic war is, if they even know of it all, okay, they might think that it's just so distant. It's like, background radiation, as a way of putting it, rather than being a frontline combatant in this war. And so that's where it's like, it's a slow evolution. But eventually, if you want this to be part of your games, you're going to have to, as a DM, work it in so that the players are going to want to feel compelled to pick a side in this battle, to choose a stance. Okay, so how are some ways that as a DM you can kind of articulate what happens when these forces sort of, let's say, the forces of law or chaos or neutrality somehow end up infecting? I'm going to use the word infect. That's maybe not the right word, but influencing a little town, a little village. And what would that look like with these three different cosmic forces? So if it's a town that has fallen to chaos, maybe chaos has gained the upper hand in this particular little town. It was like a little sleepy farming village. It was like not really all that important, but for whatever reason, it has fallen to the side of chaos. So maybe you set this up over the course of a year. Like, again, I talked about like these kind of like weird, strange dreams maybe start haunting people that live in the town. Maybe colors start appearing distorted. Chaos is the one you can, I think, have the most fun with this kind of stuff. Maybe animals being born with too many eyes or too many limbs, something like that. Like it's something's clearly wrong, because again, any one of these forces that's not in balance with the other is taken to the extreme can be bad, right? So maybe people arrive in the town and they speak in a way that like nobody can understand. They speak in riddles, or just the language that they use is very unsettling and it's off. And something's weird about it. So maybe the town calendar is no longer working. Like the seasons don't work. Harvest is now happening in the spring, or there's snow during the summer. Like all these kinds of things are signs that like something is not right in this town. Maybe the local religious authorities, the clerics that live there, are trying to conduct rituals to set things back on track, but the rituals don't work. They fail, or the outcome of those rituals is not planned because it's random. Right at this point, like anything that you do to try to add order back to things is going to backfire, and it's going to have an unintended consequence. Okay, so maybe the architecture begins to shift. I use this in the game I run for my daughter all the time. If you guys have watched my GM advice, you'll know that at a certain point they went into the town of Saltmarsh, and I added like a chaotic Cthulhu sort of cosmic war, cosmic horror aspect to the town of Saltmarsh, the old one, the U1 module, Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. And I talk a lot of times about how there's like unnatural angles in the buildings. They don't notice it right away, but once they lock in and pay attention, it really unsettles them. And I make them make composure checks, because that type of architecture shouldn't be allowed to exist in our Euclidean, universe. And so that is a fun thing that you can do, or it could just be as simple as like buildings sort of leaning unnaturally where it looks like they should fall over, but they don't. But nobody remembers maybe in the town what the town square used to look like. Okay. Like all these things, because they've all changed. And then again, I think adding children as a creepy element is a fun way to explore this. So maybe the children start humming songs that nobody knows what these songs are. Where did they learn these songs? Okay. And again, if you set this up over time, it can really add like a creepy element to the chaos. Okay. Maybe people's shadows don't match their movements. That's another one that I use all the time. So these are tinging on horror, but I think that it's the balance of the universe isn't working. The natural laws are not working in a town that's kind of been overcome by chaos. So the thing is, this town is not evil. Okay. It's just the people who live there might be scared. They might be confused. They might feel isolated, but the chaos is creeping in. And it's causing, madness, mutation, and unreason in the town. Okay, so then if you're playing out this cosmic war, once chaos has gotten the upper hand, well, what's going to happen? The other two cosmic forces are going to come in and try to set things right. So law would, of course, in this case, probably respond most strongly, but it might send like a force of sort of like very law-abiding, law and order knights. And they might have like holy relics or law. Let's not say holy. Let's say like relics of law. Okay. Like those magic items I was talking about, they're attuned to a specific cosmic force. They might send out some of their most powerful relics that can seal off whatever it is that's causing the chaos to seep in. But these knights aren't really good guys necessarily. What they want is to bring a sense of law and order to this town. So they might start demanding obedience, follow our rules or else. They're like, being punitive, punishing the town. They want order. They might arrest townsfolk that they think have been tainted by chaos. And again, like I said, punish them. So that is like an extreme example of how law might respond quickly to try to like set the scales back in balance. Okay. But then neutrality, say the cosmic force of neutrality, they might send a group of like sages, right? Or druids. I mean, druids are the classic neutral one. But the idea is that, too much law is stagnation, but too much chaos is collapse. So they want to keep the town, they want to let the town stand, but they want to redirect its trajectory so that it's not falling close to one or the other. So they're going to try to balance it back. So I think in the case of neutrality, it's probably best to play them off after a lawful force comes in and tries to overcorrect and then show like how neutrality might respond. But you don't have to do it that way. It's just an example. Okay, but what if the same thing happens, but it's a town that falls too much into law? So what might that look like? So let's say in this case that there's a town that maybe there was like a magical plague that wiped out like half the population of this town. And remember, if we're thinking of magic as being allied with or aligned with the cosmic force of chaos, that would be a problem, right? So within the town, maybe there is a group of, again, like knights. It could be paladins, because in original D&D, paladins are not good. They're just lawful. Okay. So maybe they, and then like you might have some sort of, bureaucrat types, which could be magic using bureaucrats, or they could be, something like that. But they restore order in this little town. Okay. But then over the decades, them restoring the order, well, their influence is going to grow and they're going to get more powerful. And now they're sort of ruling this town with like an iron fist. It got out of control. They were trying to correct the problem, but then again, they took it to the extreme. And so they might have very strict curfews being enforced, and they might have even gone so far as to, the classic, I think in Dungeons and Dragons terms, a classic sort of agent of law is like clockwork creatures. So they might have set up to create these like clockwork automatons who act as like the town watch or enforcers who enforce this curfew. And because they're clockwork creatures, they don't have the same like reasoning capabilities that the rest of us have. So they're not like, you're out like 30 seconds past curfew, like you're going to jail kind of thing. Like it's extreme. They might make people wear certain colors based on their social hierarchy or their job, what they do in the town, which is getting really creepy, right? Of identifying people based on the clothes that they wear and the job that they do. Okay. Or again, their social status. Okay. They might make, they might control all of the commerce in the town and make it where you can't trade things in town unless it's been stamped with a particular thing by this particular group of bureaucrats or by a particular temple where they've decided this is the temple that you have to go to for commerce, and the other temples can't be active in the town. They might license magic, and if you practice it, it's treason and you go to jail or worse. And it could be, go so far as the fact that, well, there's no crime in the town, but that's because the courts have defined any kind of disobedience as heresy, against the stance of law, and that could result in, like a death penalty kind of situation. So, a town with no crime sounds good, but this wouldn't be a paradise to live in at all. It wouldn't necessarily be a good place. It's lawful, but dissent is just crushed so heavily. Okay. So it's not done out of malice. It's done because if you're deviating from law, then they feel that is an existential threat to their way of life. Okay. So the way that chaos might respond to this, then the forces of chaos might come in and send agents, basically just chaos agents. They could be performers or a chaotic wandering way of life to interject some randomness, some rebellion into this town, like get people talking about things, get people to disobey, and plant the seeds to kind of tip the scales back. Okay. And the cosmic forces in neutrality, they might urge that the town sort of reintroduce sort of this different things, like different festivals that they've shut down, or unpredictability, doing things little by little. It would be like not an overwhelming force, but it would be like little by little, let's introduce these unpredictable elements back into the daily life. And as you do that slowly over time, I mean, this would be a slow build, but the town might correct itself by, not being so strict after a while. Okay, but then last, what if a town goes too far to the extremes of neutrality? This one's a little bit difficult, I think, to kind of explain, but we're going to do our best here. So we might have say there's a mountain village that's built on some sacred land that just is pulsing with elemental power. Okay, so elementals neutral, right? They're let's say the elementals are agents or proxies of neutrality. Okay, so the villagers might be taught to never act in extremes either way of law or chaos. Everything has to be clear and balanced. So every time that there's a birth in the town, there needs to be a death. And if the death doesn't come naturally, they might have to, move that along. Okay. Or for every time that a new building is constructed, they also have to plant a tree or a series of trees or a grove or like whatever it is, right? Which, again, that doesn't sound like a bad thing necessarily, but when taken to the extreme, it can be bad. Okay, so there could be they don't want any ruler or any priest, any leader in the town to have any more power than anybody else. So roles are rotating with the seasons, which can make things very, very difficult to get anything done. And then magic might be based on balance. So there might be certain spells that can't be used. Maybe a light spell is too associated with law, or a cure spell is too associated with law, and a darkness spell is too associated with chaos. So those spells are just, you cannot use them, and using them would be, amount to committing a crime. Okay, so spells might be, they might delay aging, but they accelerate crop cycles, or like things like that, right? So the village might be protected from intrusion by extraplanar creatures, but it also suffers from stagnation. There's no progress. There's no growth. Everything is balanced, so nothing gets out of control. So again, this wouldn't really be a paradise. It would be like a philosophical stronghold as a way of thinking about it, because neither law nor chaos would be welcome in a town like this. So neutrality is preserving that middle path so much that it even means resisting justice or ignoring your passions. So that wouldn't be great, because it's almost like you would be scared to show emotion in a town like this, either way. So law might respond by coming in to try to kind of lift the town up into giving it some structure, giving it some fixed leadership. Okay, or maybe writing the rules down of the town like a code or something like that, or regulating the use of these different sacred sites that are found within this sort of elemental nexus. Okay, they might want to have some rules about how those can be accessed. But then chaos might want to unleash some temptation for people who live there. So maybe out of the blue, the cosmic force of chaos gives one of the kids that lives in the town access to like wild magic. Okay, so some weird, wild, chaotic magic, without, there's no cost associated with it. There's no rules. They just want to see like what happens if this kid runs out in the town and starts casting these spells to kind of try to help get it a little bit out of this stagnation era of neutrality. So those are just, again, I didn't put a ton of time into thinking about those ideas, but I'm trying to give examples of how these different forces, when taken to their extremes, could affect your campaign world, and then how player characters might want to respond to that based on the stance that they've chosen to follow. Now, if you want to do this kind of thing in your game, what are some things to watch out for? Well, one of the things is you have to be very careful to not turn it into a morality system, because that's the natural default of what we want to do with alignment. We want to turn it into this is good and this is bad. And the idea here is showing that any of these can be bad if taken to the extreme, but also when used in the right way and within balance, they can be, quote unquote, good. So it's not a replacement for personality or for your ethics. It's the stance that you've chosen in this cosmic war. Okay. And you also have to be a little bit careful with player friction. That's what I was getting to earlier. If you've got a lawful character and a chaotic character, or you have a character who has taken the stance of law and a character who's taken the stance of chaos in the same party, and they go into a dungeon, they probably want to accomplish very different things in that dungeon. Now, if they're just in it for the gold, they might work together to do that. But if they've been sent to seal this up and the character who's chosen the stance of chaos doesn't want to, it can create a little bit of player friction, and you don't want that player versus, at least I don't like playing player versus player. I think it creates a lot of disharmony to the game. So it's trying to figure out, like, how can you use these cosmic forces in your game with players who are on opposite sides, and figuring out how to navigate that. And that can be a little bit tricky. And I do think if you are going to play this, although it says in Men in Magic that it's, in addition to picking your role, it says it's very important to pick a stance. Pick a stance, but I think that it's something that you might want to, again, unveil slowly. I wouldn't lock people in early. I wouldn't make player characters pick a stance at the beginning. I'd let them see what's going on in this universe. Start them out as just, again, as adventurers that are just trying to make their way in the world, and then drop in these hints of what's going on in this bigger, wider universe or multiverse, or whatever you want to call it, of the cosmos, of these forces, and let them naturally pick the stance that they want to follow based on what they see. And it can also be like the cosmic war recruits them. We talked about this, and I think that can be a fun way to look at it. If you have players that look like they're always out there trying to disrupt the status quo, maybe the forces of chaos try to recruit them. If you have a player group that, is out there for themselves, they're trying to just make some coin, but they jump in to help the sides of law and order when things are going wrong. Well, maybe the forces of law will kind of recruit them. And so, you have paladins being like the epitome of the lawful fighter in, it doesn't come in Men in Magic. It comes in the Greyhawk supplement. But again, because we're not using law as good and chaos as evil, the lawful fighter is a paladin. Well, you could have lawful magic users and lawful clerics, and yes, even lawful thieves, and you could give them different abilities, even in different names. You could create alignment specific subclasses. So you have the alignment specific subclass of paladin for fighter, and you could have alignment. You could also have a chaotic specific subclass of fighter, and a true, like a neutral one, or the neutral one could just be the fighter. Look at it that way. And but you could do that with magic users and with clerics and thieves, and maybe give them slightly different abilities. That is a fun approach that you can use for this, by letting the cosmic war recruit them, and then saying, oh, well, you've been lawful since character creation, let's say, just like it says for the paladin in the Greyhawk supplement. If you guys don't know what I'm talking about, just watch my video on the Greyhawk supplement. I'll explain all that. But that's another way that you can do this. So, just a few other things that you can do. I've been playing around with this for a while, and it eventually will be a post on my blog. But I've been thinking another way that you can approach this is by rolling your alignment with 3d6, just like you do with your other ability scores. And now I've been going back and forth and thinking, like, one way of doing it would be, a score of 13 through 18 would mean that you're lawful, with an 18 being super lawful, and a score of 3 through 8 would mean that you're chaotic, with a score of 3 being that you're like, extra chaotic, and then a score of 9 through 12 meaning that you're neutral. That's one way I've been looking at it, but another way I've been thinking about it is choosing a stance and then rolling the 3d6, and then again the score will determine exactly how much you follow that particular stance. So if you picked the side of law but then rolled a 3, that means that you've picked the stance of law, but you're very close to like not really getting involved. Whereas if you rolled an 18 for your score, then that would mean that you're like extra lawful, right? And so there might be different benefits that come in those different stages, like different bonuses and penalties, just like there are with the alignment ability scores. I haven't really fleshed it out yet. It's just an idea I've been kind of toying with for a while now. But that's something that you can do. It could be kind of fun. It's using it like a tracker almost to add tension to the game. And I think that's a score that would move, unlike your regular ability scores. That's one that could move up and down based on the actions that you take. And I think also, again, if you add this cosmic war into the game, I think it really behooves the DM to introduce unique spell effects, different boons, different bonuses for the characters when they act in line with the cosmic allegiance that they've chosen to follow. Okay, and you can use different color themes for different factions or heraldry, all that kind of stuff to reinforce this idea. But you could also, again, I think that if you're going to add bonuses, there should also be penalties if you are acting against your own. And I know, again, a lot of people don't like that. But again, this isn't personality. This is saying, I've chosen to follow the stance of law. And so then if you choose to help the side of chaos, there should be a penalty for doing that. And it doesn't have to be a mechanical penalty. It could be a role-playing penalty, right? So I think that's in there. I think another bonus that you can do for your characters or for players is creating like specific subclasses for each, like the extreme version of following these different cosmic forces. So those are just some of my ideas. I would love to hear your ideas. So, remember that alignment originally wasn't just about being like the Boy Scout, the Superman, the whatever. But it also wasn't being the Lex Luthor or the villain. It was about picking a side in a battle that most people in the world probably aren't even aware it's happening. But your player characters, those are like the top % of people that should know what's going on eventually, even if they don't know originally. And I think that we lost something in the game when we added in, from that article that Gary wrote here, when we added in this idea of good and evil. And I think that then the cosmic war kind of got lost in the sidelines. And I think it would be fun to bring it back because it's a way that you can still use alignment, even though, again, I think a lot of people in modern editions of Dungeons & Dragons don't like it. And it's because of the way that I think it's portrayed in the game system. It doesn't really have a purpose anymore. But again, that's just what I think. And I would love to hear what you think. How do you use alignment in your games? Do you use it at all? What did you think of this cosmic discussion? I mean, again, I'm not sharing anything that's like, this isn't, anything I've come up with. It's just articulating ideas that I've kind of, read over time and looking at the text, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Do you just ignore it completely? Do you like the moral aspect? Do you like the 9-point alignment system? Let me know in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you'll find places to join me on social media. You'll find links to my blog. And again, I've given you all the other links before for my shops and, where to buy my supplement and all that kind of stuff. So I would love your support if you're able to do it that way. And that's going to wrap up this video. So thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So another fun one. I always think these are fun. This is the last thing I always record. So I was telling somebody in the comments recently, you probably hear a shift in tone with me because I'm being a little less like trying to remember names and dates and facts and things like that. And I'm just kind of, again, talking sort of just off the cuff here. But today, as I'm recording this video, is Monday, May 26, 2025. And that is Memorial Day here in the United States to honor those people in our armed forces who have fallen either in the line of duty or, later on. And so I thought I wanted to do kind of like a little tribute to that, especially since my dad, as you guys know, if you've been watching the channel for a few months now at least, um, passed away in December of 2024. And he was in the Navy, and he was super proud, especially in later years, really liked talking about it. He wore his Navy hat everywhere. So, well, this is one of his hats. He actually bought a bunch, so we had a bunch on stock because he wore them so often, and they would get really dirty. So this is a newer one that he had, but we have his hat that he was wearing at the time when he passed. But so I kind of thought like, oh, let's do a little tribute to that as far as the drink. So let's talk about that first. So this is known as the Army Navy cocktail. And this is in one of the glasses that, again, if you've been watching, I grabbed this from my dad. He had these, and this is a coupe style glass, which you can't tell. I'm not going to tip it to the side because it'll spill out, but it is a stemmed cocktail glass. And the Army Navy cocktail is essentially like a gin sour. And people say, it's the origins of the cocktail are a little vague, which is true for most of the classic cocktails that we know today. People say that it was created for people to drink while tailgating at the Army Navy football game every year. Other people say it was named after the Army Navy Club in Washington, D.C. It first appears in writing in a book in 1948 called The Fine Art of Mixing Drinks. And in it, the original recipe is stated as being 2 parts gin and then 1 part each of lemon juice and orgeat, which is a syrup made with blanched almonds and sugar, and then either usually rose water or orange water. And the person who wrote that book, and I forget his name, but he stated that he thought that the recipe was completely unbalanced. And he opted for a ratio of 8 parts gin, 2 parts lemon, and 1 part sweetener, like 1 part of orgeat, I think was his ratio. So 8 to 2 to 1. The recipe that I followed does a like an 8-4-3 ratio. So 2 ounces of gin, 1 ounce of lemon juice, and then 3/4 of an ounce of orgeat. And then it also uses a dash of Angostura bitters. It's supposed to be garnished with a grapefruit peel, and I discovered I didn't have a grapefruit, so I just used a lemon peel because I use lemon juice in my drink. So again, it's like a gin sour. I used a London dry gin. But you can change the type of gin. So if you want a softer approach, you could use like a Plymouth gin if you wanted to, or even an Old Tom, which is going to make it really sweet. But, feel free to mix that up. And you can also, again, adjust these proportions between your spirit, your sugar portion, which is the orgeat, and then the lemon. Okay, so feel free to play around with this, but this is the Army Navy cocktail in honor of the armed forces and here in the United States, and again, specifically the ones that have passed on. So cheers. It's really nice. I think the balance on that is just right. It's tart without being overly tart. I don't like sweet drinks, so definitely the sweetness is kept in check. And I like the taste of gin, so I want to taste those kind of botanical herbal notes from the gin, and all that comes through. And then that little, just 1 dash of Angostura bitters is just kind of, it's almost acting as like the salt and pepper that kind of like accentuates all the other flavors. So, but that's kind of where that pinkish color is coming from, is from the Angostura bitters. So that's a cocktail. And then I just thought this was fun. So this is just a 45. But Wonder Woman wears the colors of the red, white, and blue. So if I'd had it, I would have showed the Patton soundtrack. I actually own it on CD, but I don't own it on vinyl. And I try to keep my listening here to things I own on vinyl. But Patton, definitely a great movie if you haven't seen it. Came out in 1970, which is a really awesome year. But anyway, I picked this up years ago. It was an anniversary of Wonder Woman. So 2016, which is, I also think, the year that the theatrical Wonder Woman movie came out, I think. But this one's fun. It's a picture disc. So here's Wonder Woman, Linda Carter, portraying her in all of her glory with the red, white, and blue. And then on the back is her as Diana Prince in her sort of civilian disguise. They don't really use the Diana Prince version anymore in the comics. Like Wonder Woman doesn't really go undercover, in a civilian disguise anymore. She's just Wonder Woman, and everyone knows that she's an Amazon from Themyscira, and she doesn't try to blend in. You know, she just goes out and about as Wonder Woman. But I thought this is really cool. So the theme song, this is a show from the 70s, ran for 3 seasons. Um, Started on, I think, ABC, and then I up for the first season, and then there was a hiatus, and then it came back and it ran for 2 seasons on, I believe it was CBS, if memory serves. So like mid to late 80s. But the everyone knows, I think you should all know this theme song. When Wonder Woman spins around and changes from Diana Prince to Wonder Woman, and then the theme song's playing. But was written by a man named Charles Fox and his writing partner, Norman Gimbel. And so Charles Fox wrote the theme song to The Love Boat on ABC, wrote music for ABC's Wide World of Sports, and also wrote the song Killing Me Softly with His Song. If you know that kind of like ballad song from the 70s. Well, he wrote that with Norman Gimbel. And Norman Gimbel, the lyricist, wrote music for, he did a lot of translations actually from bossa nova tunes. So like The Girl from Ipanema, which my dad hated that song for whatever reason. I like it, but he didn't like it. But it's originally written in Portuguese for a Brazilian audience. The song's written by Antonio Carlos Jobim, like the music. And then, but Norman Gimbel was the person who translated the lyrics into English for an English audience back then. So, making sure that things rhymed and the cadence and the words and all that kind of stuff works. So translating songs is not just as simple as like, Google Translate and you change it and you sing it that way. It's like a lot of times you have to tweak it in order to make it work within the musical structure. So he did that with a lot of bossa nova songs. Girl from Ipanema, again, probably being the most famous, but Summer Samba, a lot of different songs like that. So these are two very prolific and, relatively famous songwriters, especially if you were watching TV or listening to music in like the 60s and 70s and early 80s. So that's my little tribute again, the red, white, and blue here for Memorial Day. And again, a cheers, a toast to my dad again, and to any of you who have lost loved ones in the armed forces. Cheers, and thanks again, and I'll talk to you next time.